are actually really focusing on this as a problem. In the plus 50s, poor health is often cited as a major reason for why the plus 50 population is dropping out of the workforce, but actually the data is showing it's literally creating massive problems for our future economic sort of recovery and growth prospects. So I think what that points to, and really the focus of my talk, is how we cannot ignore the wider determinants of our health, and actually it really needs to enter into how we understand and develop the interventions that we need to really start to address this. And I think, and I will say, and part of the work that I've been doing, which I'll come on to, is very much understanding that we need to focus much more on the sort of the psychological, the wider environment, and the behavioral aspects that are responsible for this. So, moving on to the next slide. The crazy thing is, we all know, and actually, a big focus of the session here today and what we're talking about at the ARDD conference, some of you might have been in Dublin last week, but we all know that we've actually got amazing science and amazing technology to actually do something far more impactful than at the moment we're seeing. And I think, one of the things that we also recognize, and is part of a growing awareness, is that, our health is actually really deeply connected to our climate and the climate change agenda, actually. And that, again, that link between our wider environment is actually so paramount. So I think one of the things that came out last week, one of the speakers in Dublin of the Dublin Longevity Summit, he pointed out, this is Matt Kaberlein, who very involved in running his own moonshot, but also the Dogs Project. He kind of reminded us as a longevity community to kind of say, hang on a second, we've got our health getting worse. We actually, if you look at over the last 10 years, what we have seen come through in terms of longevity interventions, there hasn't really been that much coming through. And I think we need to, and I think this signals, and I'm going to talk a lot about mindset and how we really need to rethink what we as a longevity community and aging research community really need to be thinking about this. Like, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? We still don't have a good definition of aging. We still don't have a clarity on what aging biomarkers will tell us whether something is working in the human model. So there's actually an awful lot that we do not know. And this has been borne out by the fact that we haven't really seen very much come through. We still do not have a single drug or molecule that will outdo the effects of poor lifestyle. If you're stressed, if you're poor, if you're depressed, these all have major impacts on our health trajectory. So I think the need is we have to really see this as the next frontier. And we know that lifestyle interventions have an impact on the biology of aging. We know the hallmarks of aging. That's the frame of a lot of this conference. So kind of like what I'm saying here is that actually this is a bit of a reality check for all of us here. Like, how can we really understand how the wider environments actually deeply infect human beings? A lot of last week was talking about how, in the animal models in the lab, these are very artificial conditions. The environments in which all of these things are done are not the same as the environments in which people live in their day-to-day lives. So I think that's the next frontier, and I think this sets the basis for the mission that we launched in November, which I'll come on to in a second. So the scientific construct for this and for the mission that I'm running with the National Innovation Centre for Aging is all around this wider understanding of the exposome. And how do we, and what the factors are in the exposome that actually affect human beings. And we know that, it really comes down to some of the obvious fundamentals. It's the food that we're eating, the air that we're breathing, air pollution, smoking, the diet. That came up a lot and has kept on coming up, how deeply that affects, our health condition. Eating way too much ultra-high processed food is driving the obesity epidemic. So these are all the things that we know are actually driving poor health. But the other thing that's really important, and I think is a concept that's getting a lot more recognition, is this whole concept around resilience. We know that actually humans have very different abilities responding to stresses in their environment. Some cope much better than others. The whole move towards frailty, as you get older, some people are able to withstand operations much better than others, and it really links back to this whole concept of resilience and how we can adapt to factors in our daily lives. And actually, what we're also seeing is how important things, and again, this is in the human model, how important things are around having a sense of optimism, hope, a sense of control over our lives, how that really deeply impacts actually our health trajectory. So actually what we're trying to do in the mission is to really understand, all those impacts and all those factors using the latest data and the latest science, because if you get the data right and you're getting access to the right data, it will tell you, hopefully, the right story and help you ask the right questions about how we can really drive better health for everybody. So my premise is that we really need to understand the links between the biology, the psychology, and the behavioral aspects of aging. And with that, we'll have a much better understanding of how we can cope and to stress in our environments and our state of resilience. So we also know that, and that figure that you see there, it talks about the whole links between aging and the exposome, and that's Paul Shields, based up in Newcastle, in Glasgow. And he's done a lot of really interesting work showing how deeply affected, wider socioeconomic factors in people's environments affect their health status. I think what he also says, and what we're finding out from the research, is that actually the resilience and how people adapt to stresses and all the areas around the hallmarks of aging, markers like chronic inflammation, they vary between, in individuals depending on their stage in life. It varies between cells, organs, and so really this whole kind of human as a complex system really needs to be understood. The other thing that's really important to stress, and I say this because Alex Zavaronkov has been one of the leaders in this respect with his team at In Silico and at Deep Longevity, is that psychological aging is hugely underexplored at the moment, and he's been doing some fascinating work using specific clocks that, of course, his team has been developing in the lab to actually understand this, what impact your psychological state actually has on your biological age. And so he's done a number of studies and has got some really interesting sort of the future, I think it's called future tests. You can actually assess your psychological age, but he's done recently a study in 12,000 adults in China, showing if you don't sleep well, if you are stressed, if you're lonely, if you're unhappy, that deeply affects your biological age. In fact, they calculated that has more of an effect than smoking. So that's actually quite extraordinary. So I think we cannot ignore these sorts of this sort of evidence. So this all points that we do need to think differently and not just focus on the biology of aging. So with my colleagues at the National Innovation Center for Aging, we are trying to understand, the human exposome. And what that will take is quite a lot, because it's obviously very, very complex. But what we want to do is essentially create what we're calling an open federated testbed, connecting up data sets from around the world. And of course, the technology now has arrived where you can actually, privacy preserving, and actually in the UK, for example, there's a huge initiative underway, this federated data platform, where you can access data without going to the data, to be able to get the insights that you need to really understand, data at scale. And twinned with a lot of regulatory developments to actually understand and actually open up access to data. These are presenting huge opportunities to be able to draw data at scale from the likes of UK Biobank, but also other biobanks around the world, which are all very, very busy collecting lots and lots of data, blood samples, but also we have data from our homes, from the air that we're breathing. We have got a lot of data that we need to understand. And the other thing to mention is that like in certain countries in the world, like in India, but also these are the things that the UK government are looking at, digital identity. These are all mechanisms whereby if you twin that with developments in personal data wallets and platforms where the citizen can consent to sharing their data with whoever they like, this starts to open up a wealth of possibilities to access data at scale, which reflects the data in the exposome, the wider environments. And so some of the things that we're that we're seeing as outputs, you can see on that slide, sorry, it might be a little bit small for the people in the back, this will fuel a whole sort of next generation developments in products and services. It'll inform, aging biomarker banks. It'll also hopefully one day lead to a much better understanding of all the geroprotective sort of interventions, both at an individual level, but also at an exponential level and at a population level. Which is essentially, because I think the big holy grail is really understanding how we're impacted in terms of our biology, but also the wealth of other sort of interventions that we have, lifestyle, all the other things that we know about. So with that, some of the things to mention is that we're working with quite a number of really interesting international partners, and actually these are, we've published a paper in The Lancet in November that kicked off this mission, and a lot of them are pioneers. I mean, many of them are here actually near Basel, like Alex and Brian Kennedy and so forth. These are all people who are involved in this mission. But we're also connecting up with partners like Our Future Health in the UK, which are recruiting 5 million healthy volunteers, collecting blood samples. So we're in discussion with them about influencing their protocols, about what they measure. And of course, we're also involved in a whole bunch of international discussions around aging biomarkers and so forth. There's the AFAR FAST initiative. There's the Aging Biomarkers consortium in the US. There's one that's now just set up in China. So there's groups like Nightingale Health, which have over 2 million blood samples. You know, they're doing a huge amount of work with metabolomics, understanding how stress affects metabolomics. So we are connected up with this vast array of international partners around the world, really trying to understand where the data is and how we connect up that data. So this really is just about essentially giving you an indication of the length of, I mean, this is a large and a very long-term project, sort of 10 to 20 years we're reckoning. 10 years, hopefully we can do a lot in 10 years, but it just gives you a sense of how we're seeing the timing on this. So what are the levers that we can pull? Because there's an awful lot of barriers. We know there's been we know that there are many barriers to progress, but what are the actual levers to actually do something like this? So I'll point to, I mean, I think a lot of you here will know that there is huge, massive developments in science and technology that will allow us to understand, you know, humans as a complex system. We know, and a lot of the developments we're going to see at this conference, we're going to see in terms of, you know, thanks to AI, we've got obviously generative AI, we've got ChatGPT, we've got, you know, AlphaFold, you know, being able to decipher every protein known to man. You know, these are all things going to have a massive impact in the future. But I think also there's some speakers here which are doing some pretty phenomenal work using, and again, it comes back to the data and the AI. I think Giro.ai are going to be here. They're doing some amazing work, you know, understanding and looking at data, for example, in UK Biobank, looking at and projecting on the basis of the data maximum human lifespan. They've reckoned as 138 years, but where they're coming from is actually understanding this mechanism of this whole understanding of homeostasis and humans' ability to withstand stress, that mechanism of resilience, which I think is really, really interesting. And so they're actually looking at the data and coming up with some pretty powerful arguments about how we really need to see things differently. The other point to make is, you know, this whole sort of citizen and consumer activation side. So one of the things and one of the hats that I've worn and continue to do is working quite closely with government. I ran for 4 years the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Longevity, and of course we're very connected with government. You know, governments, politicians, they rely on people voting for them. So in the end, you know, a big part of what we need to do is to take this understanding of science and technology to the citizen, the consumer, who needs to understand, well, what does this all mean? Politicians need to understand that. So I think the kind of things that we have, tools that we have at the moment to activate the consumer, and some of them are here. They're going to be, there's apps like New, there's Humanity app, there's a whole bunch, there's Mudo, there's all sorts of tools. We also have smart technologies in the home that are collecting data on how we live our lives, and, you know, the use of sensors. So there's massive amounts of opportunities to really engage the citizen in all this. But in the end, they have to see, like, what is it really going to do for me? How is it really going to impact my life? So we have to use a different sort of language, and I think this is where another message at this conference. Now, another thing which is interesting, and this again is in the UK context, who, you know, let's face it, you know, we're kind of trying to work out our role in the world, you know, coming out of Brexit. There's a lot of countries doing amazing stuff. You know, Singapore, I mean, just look at what Singapore is doing. We've got China, we've got, you know, India, who through digital identity had got their entire, over 1 billion people being able to access, you know, banks, microfinance, and that was all through digital identity. There's, you know, there's massive stuff happening outside of our walls, and this is something that the UK government are looking at. So I mentioned things like agile digital reform, for example. They're looking at opening up access to data sets, you know, outside the NHS and care record. How do you do that? That's through things like personal digital data wallets. They're looking at finance reforms, you know, how do you open up more funding to go into this space? So looking at pension funds, consolidating pension funds to invest in higher innovation areas. So all these sort of regulatory developments are really, really important because that is an enabler of innovation and an enabler for growth. And so the UK government are basically very, very busy at looking at a whole raft of opportunities to essentially put us in a position to hopefully one day be considered, a science and tech superpower, maybe not quite doing the Silicon Valley model, but actually in the end trying to create models to help the startup ecosystem be more successful. So some of the things that I've been working on is, for example, looking at what has worked in the finance world, like open banking, which opened up access to citizen data. Why can't we take some of those models into the health space? So we published a big paper, and this is again with the APPG, on the Open Life Data Framework. So looking at citizen-consented data, the models that will foster ethical business models and investment cases. So we're running a sandbox that's really pulling together the policymakers, the finance community, the scientists, to work out what are going to be the business models of the future, the investment cases for the future to invest in health. And so wearing my other hat, another tool that we're looking at is how do you actually incentivize the asset management, the pension funds, to really invest for health, as we do in the same way for ESG investment, which is de-incentivizing investment from fossil fuels into clean energy. Why not take some of those models? Health is connected to climate. So these are all the sorts of things that we're looking at. And again, are part of what government are interested in to open up at scale more innovation. So these are the sorts of things that the UK are looking at. I'm not saying we're a bit behind, and I think there's a lot of stuff happening in the other parts of the world that we need to look to. But I think it's an interesting environment. And I think our Future Health and UK Biobank, these are opportunities that can really help us drive some of this new sea shift in thinking. But I think fundamentally, and I think I've got 10 more minutes, I hope I'm right, fundamentally, and I think this does actually link up with psychology, I think it poses all of us as a community to kind of go out of our silos and to really rethink, like, what are we trying to do here? And actually what is, because at the moment in the UK, and this is very much the case elsewhere, we have funding going into academic research, which at the moment is very competitive. So scientists, academics, are all fighting for the same funding. And what you see, and I'm an assessor at UK Research and Innovation, what you see is that funding is going into the stuff that people know about. And I would argue this is the same thing that is at risk of happening in the aging community. We're all very, very siloed in our specific domains. We have to step outside and look at the bigger picture. What actually are we trying to do here? Is it about extending health span for everybody? Is it about rich people? Is it about dealing with all the factors that really we know impact our health? We know that lifestyle really impacts our health. So I think these are the fundamental questions that all of us as a community, and we know that the Holy Grail is actually coming up with those mix of interventions which can hopefully one day be measured through an agreed internationally set of biomarkers. What is that mix of interventions what is actually going to work at an individual level, but also at a population health level? So I think that's the bigger picture stuff that we really have to ask. We have to incentivize research so that it's collaborative, so it's not competitive. We have to work together. And so I think these are the sorts of things which actually, with all the work that I've been doing working with government, academics, organizations, public sector, that is actually one of the biggest constraints of progress, is actually being too insular and being too focused on what we know. And I think the big message, and I think for all of us here, we have to help educate and evangelize how this science and technology can really help and benefit billions of people on this planet. So I think that's an important message, and it comes down to mindset. So I think all of us need to open up our mindsets and look actually at the data and the evidence. And this is where AI and all the other sort of tools that we have, quantum and systems biology, will help us do that. So just coming on, so what is this mission going to actually look like? So some of the two big things here is this idea of creating this, what we've called the exposomic AI platform. And what we mean by that, I know I mentioned this sort of federated testbed. And what we mean by that is it's actually coming up with a way in which, and again, informed by the sandbox that we're running, which again is about bringing the scientists, the policymakers, the regulators, the business community together. How are we actually going to create a platform that will be able to federate all these different data sources? Electronic health records, yes. UK Biobank, biobanks in Singapore, Japan, the 2 million blood samples that for Nightingale Health have, all the work that's being done in the States. How are we going to do that? So this is where it's going to be hard work, and we have to work with an international community. So if you Google quantum healthy longevity Lancet, you'll see a number of the people who are involved with us doing this. But essentially, that in parallel needs to be done with a whole host of a number of other sort of initiatives that will feed into this platform. And I'm just going to cut through a little bit more quickly here, because I do want to make sure I focus on this thing which I wasn't able to talk too much about in Dublin, just because I got very, very rushed by talking so much about the politics of all this, is a City of Longevity program, which is part of this mission that, again, is being incubated at the National Innovation Centre for Aging. We already have a number of cities that are actually part of this longevity program, and I see a few people here already who were talking about potentially having other cities join us who aren't yet part of the program. But this is very much an opportunity to almost create what we're calling local exposome test beds. So actually, how do you engage, policymakers, the city mayors, the people who are actually responsible for the health of their populations in cities, recognizing that actually the vast majority of the world's population live in cities. And actually, you've got structures there that are all about, engaging citizens, politicians, business people, and certainly in the UK, they're very, very focused on the devolution agenda and supporting and putting funding in regions, knowing that actually if you have prosperity reaching a region, you've got investment heading a region, you get jobs in that region, you get companies being built up in that region, you have transport links in that region, that's when your health improves. So it's all connected. And I think we've got a massive opportunity to take all the amazing stuff that we're doing in longevity and science, let and get people who we need to convert and understand and take all of this mainstream. So this is part of what the City of Longevity is all about. Do come in. So you'll see a few cities on that slide. We launched on the 6th of July. There's a bunch of Buenos Aires. We've got cities in Italy, Spain. We've got a whole bunch of cities already signed up to this program. And essentially, and I'll just move to the other side, we essentially want to create what works in these different cities, what's working like in Singapore, what's working in Madrid or Tokyo or whatever it might be, and actually create almost a codified way of actually learning from each other, and actually creating what we're longevity interface protocols, codifying in a way that we can actually share the data eventually, but actually sharing what works, and creating these longevity cities, creating and having an opportunity. And I'll come on to this challenge idea, which is also connected with the City of Longevity. We're running a challenge program. How do you actually add 1 year of healthy life expectancy within 5 years in 100 cities around the world? So that puts almost like a very specific parameter. And that the UK have had a goal for since 2017 about increasing healthy life expectancy and minimizing health and well-being inequalities. So we're trying to take that goal, and we already know that Singapore have a similar goal. We were just talking about in the taxi. So how do you create, with Brian and Claire, how do we actually create a focus of attention for people who in the end are going to be making those decisions on a policy front, who are going to be investing, who need to understand actually what does it mean to have a city that is really focused on creating health for its citizens. So this is a program we're running, and I can tell that Max wants me to stop very soon.
I want you to stop.
But I'm actually almost there, so I've been very good on my time this time, get in touch. We are rolling out and speaking to cities like Paris. I know I've been speaking to Max about, and I was there with Max in Zuzalu, but there's a whole bunch of other cities that we're speaking to. Lisbon we're speaking to. I'm hoping to speak to Jose about Spain. So there's a bunch of cities we want to be part of that 100 Cities program, but it's fundamentally about bringing the science and longevity, science and technology of longevity and aging research into the mainstream, into the public discourse, and get the funding and the results that we need to see with everything that we need to do as a community. So I will stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tina, for all the efforts. We have time for 2 questions.
Thanks. Just want to say thanks, Tina, for bringing this into the dialogue, bringing the some of the deeper questions of not just do we want to live longer, but why. Mm-hmm. I'm just curious if you've been looking at the work of Dan Buettner and Blue Zones and some of the Blue Zones projects, because it sounds in a way related.
It's very, very related. So I published a book about 3-4 years ago and actually looked at the Blue Zones. It was all on AI and health. And actually, if you look at actually the success factors in the Blue Zones, it's all the simple stuff that your grandma told you. And it's all the stuff that we know about that we need to be doing. We need to sleep better, we need to have friends, we need to be connected to our families, we need to feel part of a community, we have to feel looked after and cared for and loved, we need to eat better food, we need to build in activity in our daily lives rather than just being in a car all the time. That needs to feed into all the policies that should be supported by cities and governments, to get us to eat better, stop, we've got to find a way of reducing investment in these companies that kill us with all this junk food. That's government. They need to, we need to look at all the raft of the stuff that we know is what works. And so I kind of feel that in some ways we kind of need to go backwards, actually really look at, the human condition. And actually, and the blue zones, I'll speak to that, the sense of purpose, ikigai they call it in Japan, the sense of purpose. What inspires us to want to live? I mean, it is about feeling connected to the world and having a reason for being. So these are all, this is fundamentally what we need to understand. And I think the exciting frontier, which is, I think, the message, is that we now have the science and technology showing. I would love to do a trial on how many years having a sense of hope, would actually give to our life expectancy, and actually how it affects our aging biomarkers, the hallmarks of aging. These are the sorts of things that we need to look at, and this is not what's being looked at the moment.
So we have to make a wrap here. Fantastic, Tina. Thank you very much, and thank you for